Bob Woodward is no stranger to this section. He's been speaking with us before. For those of you who do not know him, he has been at the top of the American journalism and as a reporter and book author for the last 4 decades. He has shared 2 Pulitzer Prizes at the Washington Post, one for his and Carl Bernstein's reporting on Watergate, and one as the lead reporter for coverage in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. He's had 17 #1 best-selling nonfiction books. I'm told that that is the record for one author at this time. And dating back to the events that he's going to be talking about today, in 1972, his and Bernstein's work was called maybe the single greatest reporting effort of all time. That's a quote from Gene Roberts, the then managing editor of the New York Times. Let me tell you how this is going to work. Bob is going to speak. It's not going to be an interview like yesterday, something in the order of half an hour, and then he's going to take Q&A for something in the order of half an hour from you. And how he uses the podium will be up to him, but we will have 4 mics available. People will be carrying them. If you want to ask a question, stand up, signal, wave your hands. He will be the gentleman who decides to call on you, and I think we just have the best interaction that way. So without further ado, a friend of the section, Bob Woodward.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Good to
Bob.
see you. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, particularly in Chicago. I was raised out in Wheaton, which is one of the suburbs here, 25 miles out. And my father was a lawyer and then became the chief judge out there in DuPage County, and then was on the appellate court in Illinois. And ever since I was very little child, he impressed on me the importance of lawyers. And he said they have the most important and profound things to say unless you listen very carefully. It was a good warning. Somebody reminded me of a story I had told some years ago about Edward Bennett Williams, who was the very famous criminal lawyer in Washington. He represented the Washington Post for years. He owned the Redskins. He owned the baseball team. He was quite a presence in Washington. And during the Reagan administration, we were writing lots of stories about the CIA activities and getting a lot of resistance from people in the Reagan White House about sensitive national security, covert operations, and so forth. And we're going back and forth and never really resolving it. So it was a Saturday morning like this. I made it an appointment to go see Ed Williams in his office. Now, he represented the Post, but he also was my personal lawyer. And so went in, and before we got started, he said, I just need to tell you that I am the general counsel to President Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and I also represent the CIA director, Bill Casey, personally. And I recall sitting there and saying, Ed, so you represent me, you represent the Washington Post, you represent the president, you represent the CIA director. Isn't there some sort of conflict in this? And he looked at me with a straight, passionate face, and he said, I like to represent the situation. Which, of course, is every lawyer's dream. And he represented the situation extremely well. And in this case, I don't think there's anybody, a lawyer or any political figure in Washington now, who would have the credibility and the authority and the sense of balancing interests like Ed, and he was able to do it. And we were able to write the things that we thought the public needed to know about CIA activities. And at the same time, we drew a line voluntarily that some of the issues were really so sensitive and should not be published. In fact, some of them are so sensitive that in this era of WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, they would not even be published. So the presence of somebody like Ed, he was a force, and he could give you all kinds of advice. And a couple of years later, he asked me to come have breakfast with him at the hotel he owned, the Jefferson in Washington. And we sat down, and he said, "I want you to help me write my memoirs." And I said, "Well, I don't think I try to maintain my role as an outsider, and I don't want to." And he said, "No, I've really got some great stuff." And I said, "Well, okay." "What?" And he said, and this is what interested, he said, "Well," and then he, which was not like Ed, he hesitated. He said, "Well, there were cases that weren't cases, that never became cases." And I said, "So you mean these are instances when you put the fix in with the judge or the Justice Department?" And he said, "Well, you could look at it that way." And I said, "Well, what are they?" And he said, "Well, I can't talk about them." And I said, "Well, how about in the book?" Oh, he said, "Absolutely not." Ed never wrote his memoirs. I'm going to talk about Watergate, and I'm going to try to compress what I have to say and then spend the time. I'd love to hear what your questions are on this subject. We used to say in Washington, of course, there are a lot of criminal defense lawyers who have a high percentage of their clients indicted. Nixon was the only client to have a high percentage of his lawyers indicted. Unique status. I think because it's been 4 decades, and had the chance to think about this, and a lot more information has come out. The question is, what was Watergate? And a lot of people think, it was a break-in at the Democratic headquarters, which it was, but that was only a small fraction of what Watergate really was about. And there emerged the notion, because there was a legal focus on it, that the cover-up was the issue. And a lot of people, including Nixon, would say, well, the cover-up was worse than the crime. Actually, because there have been hundreds of hours of Nixon tapes transcribed and put out since his resignation in '74, because the memoirs, because of all the investigations of Special Prosecutor, House Judiciary Committee, Senate Watergate Committee, which played a pivotal role in this. Turns out, when you look at it, the crime is much worse than the cover-up. In fact, I think you could argue we never really understood the many tentacles of Watergate. And it was Senator Ervin who headed the Senate Watergate Committee, who near the end of his tenure in the Senate, addressed the question, what was Watergate? And his definition was, Watergate was really to destroy the integrity of the process by which the President of the United States is nominated, the candidates are nominated, and one is eventually elected. And when you look at the record, that's exactly right. What Watergate was a frontal assault on free elections. Everything that was done, not just the break-in, but the sabotage, the spying activity, which was much more extensive than we realized at the time, was for Nixon and his people to destroy Senator Muskie, who was the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination, and get a weaker candidate nominated. And it turned out George McGovern won the nomination. And if you go through the record, you really see how the spine and sabotage, which was very well funded, cleverly devised, pernicious in so many ways, really did destroy the Muskie candidacy. Real quickly, as my former colleague and I, Carl Bernstein, have thought about Watergate, what was it? It really was 5 consecutive and overlapping wars that Nixon himself orchestrated. And the first war, and this was before the Watergate break-in, but it turns out that gumshoeing and burglary, wiretapping, political sabotage had really become a way of life in the Nixon White House. The first war was against the anti-war movement. Nixon had concluded that those who opposed the Vietnam War were subversive and felt that those people constrained his ability to conduct the war in Southeast Asia on his terms. And so one of the first acts in 1970 was a young lawyer named Thomas Charles Houston, University of Indiana Law, 1966, devised what became known as the Houston Plan, which was the idea of we were going to revive surreptitious entries, wiretapping, mail covers, and so forth, and to direct, to essentially set aside the law. And Houston, being a good lawyer, told Nixon, this is clearly illegal. Nixon approved it. It was in force for a very short time because the then FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, it wasn't that he objected to the illegality, it's that he objected to the idea, hey, break-ins, wiretapping, that's our turf. The FBI, we can't let anybody else in on this. And so it was suspended, but not in Nixon's head. And again, this is the evidentiary purity of these tape recordings. They are absolutely astonishing, and they come out, I think just a couple of months ago there was another batch. There's one particular tape that gives you dramatic insight to the mindset of Richard Nixon. And this was a tape, June 17th, 1971, precisely to the day, 1 year before the Watergate break-in. They're meeting in the White House, and it's Nixon, Haldeman, his chief of staff, and Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor. And it turns out there was a file, supposedly, about the 1968 bombing halt in Vietnam that President Johnson had ordered, and there was some suspicion that the motivation was political to get Hubert Humphrey elected rather than Richard Nixon. And Nixon was on fire about this, and they're trying to get the file. Turns out they believed a copy was in the think tank of the Brookings Institution. And so, according to the tape, Haldeman, the chief of staff, says to Nixon and Kissinger, you can blackmail Johnson on this stuff. Blackmail, not just kind of leverage it, but blackmail. And you look at this and you think, do you think that Thomas Jefferson sat around and said, gee, we can blackmail George Washington? There's no evidence. Well, then after Haldeman says this, Kissinger, yeah, but Bob Haldeman and I have been trying to get this damn thing for a long time. So Nixon steps in, the action CEO and president, and says, I want us to get this file. I want it implemented on a thievery basis. God damn it, go to the Brookings Institute, get in and get those files, blow the safe and get it. You know, typical conversation in the Oval Office. 13 days later, Nixon, he's obsessed with this. He said, I want that file. Break in and take it out. You understand. The next morning, he's asking, he said, I've got to get that safe cracked over there. Who's going to break into the Brookings institution? This, willingness to, it just wasn't a willingness. The President of the United States ordering persistently a break-in, blow the safe. There's no ambiguity here. The second war that Nixon conducted was against the press. And that after the Pentagon Papers were published in '71, they set up this unit called the Plumbers, which was a investigative and turned out to be a burglary team. You had Bug Krogh here yesterday talking about that. He worked, the unit was set up by John Ehrlichman, Stanford Law, 1951, Bud Krogh, University of Washington School of Law, 1968. And they hired Gordon Liddy, former FBI agent, Liddy, Fordham Law School, 1958. And Liddy's companion, Howard Hunt, a former CIA agent, had been hired by Chuck Colson, who was really a special counsel to Nixon, very close to him. The tough guy, Georgetown Law, 1959. And they decided in order to discredit Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, as you may recall, they ordered a break-in into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to get dirt on him and smear him. Nixon's tapes, again, revealing this mindset, quite upset about Ellsberg and the leak of the Pentagon Papers. Nixon, on one of the tapes in this period, you can't drop the case. In other words, there has to be an indictment of Ellsberg. You can't let the Jew steal that stuff and get away with it. You understand. Nixon went on. People don't trust these Eastern establishment people. He's Harvard, he's a Jew, and he's an arrogant intellectual. Nixon then goes on several days later. The government is full of Jews. Second, most Jews are disloyal. Generally speaking, this is Nixon on tape, you can't trust the bastards. They turn on you. As part of the war against the press, Kissinger ordered and set up 17 wiretaps on reporters and White House aides who were suspected of leaking. As Nixon said in a February 22nd, 1971 tape, quote, in short, it would be much easier, wouldn't it, to run this war in Vietnam in a dictatorial way, kill all the reporters, and carry on the war. A sentiment I think that many people in the Oval Office maybe have felt, but Nixon expressed it. The third war essentially was to take this burglary team, the Plumbers, and declare war on the Democrats. And it was John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General, Mitchell, Fordham School of Law, class of 1938. And he met with Gordon Liddy 3 times in the Attorney General's office, and Liddy presented this espionage and intelligence and sabotage plan called Gemstone. And it had elements like mugging squads, kidnapping teams, electronic surveillance against the various targets, including the headquarters of Democratic presidential candidates Muskie and McGovern. One operation, codenamed Operation Sapphire, would station prostitutes on a yacht. It would be wired for sound and video, and hopefully they would catch some of the Democratic delegates in this compromising position and use it to blackmail them. This is in the Attorney General's office. The first plan was going to cost $1 million, and Mitchell had, his only objection was it was too expensive. And then Liddy came back with a $500,000 plan. That was still too expensive, so it was cut back to $250,000. And according to Jeb Magruder, who was Mitchell's deputy when Mitchell went to run the Nixon re-election effort, Mitchell approved that. Whether Mitchell has denied that, he's not alive now, but whether he approved it or not, it went ahead. There was a whole sabotage operation, 50 saboteurs. Nixon's appointment secretary, Dwight Chapin, hired a man named Donald Segretti, and they went around the country really putting out false press releases about the candidates. If there was something you could think of to do against the Democratic candidates, they did it. For instance, one technique was, and it sounds kind of benign, but if you talk to people who were on the campaign, it was everything but benign. They would go out on a campaign trip and stay in a hotel, and everyone would put their shoes outside their door. And then one of Segretti's operatives, about 2 o'clock, would come around with a garbage bag and collect all the shoes and throw them in a dumpster outside of town. And no one in the morning had shoes, including the candidate Muskie. And there were things like this just eating at them the whole time. Nixon also wanted to do, even though Teddy Kennedy wasn't running, he and Haldeman got some Secret Service agent they were close to get assigned to the Kennedy detail. He had a Secret Service detail at that point, and as Nixon said on the tapes, he wanted to get pictures of Kennedy in compromising positions. Quote, we might get lucky and catch this son of a bitch and ruin him. It's going to be fun, according to the President of the United States. The fourth war of Watergate was the cover-up, the war against justice, which so much is known about. There are, again, things on the tapes that have come out over the decades where, for instance, just about 6 weeks after the Watergate operation, Nixon's meeting with Haldeman. They're worried about the 5 burglars talking, and Nixon says they have to be paid for their silence. That's all there is to it. There are all the meetings with John Dean, Georgetown Law, 1965, and in which they discussed the cover-up, paying, getting more money for to buy the silence of the burglars. There was a $350,000 cash slush fund kept in Rosemary Wood's safe in the White House. They discussed the possibility of using priests to help hide payments to the burglars, washing some of the money through Las Vegas or New York bookmakers, impaneling a grand jury so everyone could plead the Fifth Amendment or claim memory failure. Astonishing what's on these tapes. Now, the fifth war of Watergate was Nixon's war against history, in which he spent 20 years after he resigned, essentially saying, and he said it, I guess he made clear his thoughts to David Frost in those famous interviews, and Nixon said, well, if the president does it, it's legal. He felt he was not accountable. After the final, it was in July of 1974, the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 that Nixon had to turn over his tapes. And interestingly, if you look at all of this, it's not the Democrats or the media that forced Nixon's resignation, or the prosecutors, or the tapes themselves, as stark as they were. It was the Republicans. The Republicans, to set up the Senate Watergate Committee, which really got the ball rolling with government investigations, was voted on by the Senate 77-0. Can you imagine now a Congress voting unanimously on anything, let alone an investigation? Inconceivable. But there were Republicans at that time, foremost Barry Goldwater, who finally said too many lies, too many crimes. There were Republicans who said Nixon had to go, and that's why he resigned. I would focus for a moment on Senator Ervin, who set up the Senate Watergate Committee. I remember in January 1973, he called me up and said, come on up and see me. And he said, we're going to set up this committee and investigate Watergate. Can you tell me who your sources are? Carl and I had written this series of stories about White House committee to re-elect Nixon involvement in a lot of this sabotage and spying. And I said, no, we're not going to talk about our sources. And he was a constitutionalist at core, and he said, I understand, but we're going to go ahead with the investigation. You think about Senator Ervin, and you look at the biographies of all these people. Ervin was born in 1896, the 19th century. He saw combat in World War I in France, won a Silver Star, went to Harvard Law School, graduated in 1922. In 1922, Nixon was 9 years old. And then at the end of his Senate career, Ervin, in a potent way, addressed the question, why? Why was Watergate? And I think he answered it as well as anyone has. He said it was a lust for political power, to gain political power and to retain political power. That those involved were blinded to ethical considerations and legal requirements and had no comprehension of Aristotle's notion of what government is, and that is that the good of man must be the end of politics. And if you look at all of this, the end for Nixon was himself, and he lost his moral authority in the end. And if you spend enough time with these tapes, what kind of jumps off the page at the end, reading transcripts or listening, is the dog that doesn't bark. And the dog that doesn't bark on the Nixon tapes, to my knowledge, no one asks the question, what's good for the country? What does the country need? It's always about Nixon. It's always about using the power of the presidency for vengeance and score settling. And so Carl Bernstein and I look back on the stories we wrote in 72, 73, 74, and that really is not the Watergate we know now from the record. That was only a glimpse of something that was far worse. And if you try to summarize it, what was Watergate, it's remarkable. Nixon had turned his White House into a criminal enterprise. And the day Nixon resigned, which was August 9th, 1974, and this is part of the paradox of Nixon. He'd gone on television the night before and announced he was going to resign. And then the next day, the day of resignation, he called his cabinet friends, key White House aides to the East Room of the White House. It was televised live on national television. He had his wife, 2 daughters, 2 son-in-laws there. And I know a lot of the people in the audience, this was Nixon raw. He had no script. He was sweating. He talked about his mother. He talked about his father. People were worried he was going to be the first person to go bonkers on live national television because he was stressed up in a way that it's quite remarkable. He got through it. And there's a point at which he kind of waves his hand like, "This is why I called you here." And then he said the following: "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." And the day of leaving, he understood what had happened, that hate was the piston that was driving his presidency. And he, in the end, destroyed himself. And he realized it. Quite astonishing that at that moment he would understand in a rather personal way what he had done and the poison of hate. Real quickly, it was a month after Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford's president. Some of you may recall this. Ford went on television in September '74, early on a Sunday morning, announcing that he was giving a full pardon to Nixon for Watergate. Now, of course, Ford went on television early on a Sunday morning, hoping no one would notice. Like many things in politics, it didn't work out. It was noticed, but not by me. I was asleep. And Carl Bernstein called me up and said, "Have you heard?" And I said, I haven't heard anything. Now, Carl truly has the ability to say what occurred in the fewest words with the most drama. And he said, "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." Happy to report, even I got it. And if you think at the time, I mean, my thought was perfect. It's the final corruption of Watergate, that the guy at the top gets off, 40 people go to jail. There was an aroma of a deal. There's the whole question of justice, why Nixon is the only one to get a pardon and so forth. And if you look at the history, 2 years later in '76, Carter beat Ford in large part because of the suspicions about the pardon and the sense of Nixon, Ford, what's going on here. And I really thought this was this was the wrong tack, and that is, as I said, in a very dark way, perfect that Nixon gets off. Then 25 years later, I undertook a project, book called Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate in the presidencies of Ford through Clinton, and looked at what the Watergate, special prosecutor law, just kind of what happened in each one of these administrations as it dealt with the legacy of Watergate, which was large, still is large. And I remember calling Gerald Ford up and asked, saying, I'd like to talk to you about the pardon, figuring that'd be the last thing he'd want to do, and he'd say, I'm sorry, I have a golf tournament, and hang up. He said, no, I'll be happy to talk to you. He was in New York the first time I talked. So I went up there. He was at a board meeting. And Ford turned out to be one of the most open people I've ever dealt with in politics. And I had the luxury of time. 2 assistants, we got all the legal memos, we read all the memoirs from people who'd worked in the Ford White House, interviewed everyone who was still alive, excavated it and wrote drafts of, okay, this is what really happened. This was, and this is what it might mean. And interviewed Ford a number of times at his home in Colorado, interviewed him many times at his home in Rancho Mirage, California. Okay, what really happened here? Why? And I remember the last interview with Ford. And I just asked, why'd you pardon Nixon? And he said, oh, you keep asking that question. And I said, well, I don't think you've really answered it. And he said, okay, I'm going to tell you. And these are the moments you live for in journalism. And he said, I'll tell you precisely what happened as I saw it. In September 74, I had to assess where we were as a country. And the economy was in real trouble. It was the middle of the Cold War. He had a letter from Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, essentially saying Nixon's going to be investigated as a private citizen. Anyone who looked at even the tapes available at that time and the testimony, clearly Ford said Nixon would be indicted, would be convicted, and maybe go to jail. And he said, so we'd have 2 or 3 more years of Watergate. And he said, I could not stand that. And he said in this very plaintive way, he said, I needed my own presidency. He then said, I pardoned Nixon, not for myself, but for the country. And we had to get Nixon off the front page. We had to get him out of the system. The stain of Watergate was never going to be erased, but we had to move forward. And as part of the deal he made with Nixon, it was that Nixon, who by tradition owned all his papers and tape recordings, had to give the tape recordings back to the government. So that's how we really got all of the other tapes that weren't unearthed by the special prosecutor. And I remember kind of thinking about this, and in the book Shadow, I wrote that what Ford did, actually, rather than kind of the final corruption, was a very gutsy thing to do. And Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of John F. Kennedy, the late president, called me up and said that she'd read, and she and her uncle Teddy Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, had read in the book about what happened here. And she said, we've decided we're going to give Gerald Ford the Profiles in Courage Award for pardoning Richard Nixon. And so some time later at the Kennedy Library, Teddy Kennedy was at the microphone, and Ford was next to him. And he said, because in 1974, Kennedy said the pardon of Nixon was almost a criminal act. And Kennedy said, I was wrong. This was a true act of courage, somebody, in a sense, sacrificing their own political future for the national interest. And these profiles in my brother's book are about politicians who do this, and Gerald Ford did that and paid a political price. And I remember watching this and seeing it, and What a cold shower. And what a humbling experience, because I remember in '74, I was so sure it was corrupt. And so something looks this way, and then you subject it to neutral inquiry and history for 25 years, and it looks the exact opposite. And so I had it wrong. And I didn't even need to go to law school. I got it wrong on my own. Thanks so much, and let's do questions.
Thank you, and I did want to ask you about shadow. It offers the very interesting hypothesis, and then I think demonstrates that each presidency through the Clinton administration was profoundly affected by the legacy of Watergate and how they responded, how they dealt with things, how they managed matters of interest. And so my question to you is, since Shadow's now a dozen years old or so, what do you think is the continuing, or has been the continuing legacy for the two succeeding presidencies, the Bush administration and the Obama administration?
I think it's less, but what's happened is I think the power of the presidency has gone up, quite frankly, in each successive administration. I think Obama has more power than George W. Bush did, and Bush had more power than Clinton. I mean, what happens in the White House, sometimes I think somebody ought to investigate the air handling system in the White House, because I think there's something that comes out there that makes people not exercise their best judgment. And what I should have said under the kind of why Watergate particularly, no one, I've thought for a long time that if Nixon had one strong lawyer who believed in the rule of law, who went in there and heard about this stuff and slammed his fist down and said, "You are the President of the United States. You cannot do this," that it might have had an impact. I've since, as more and more tapes have come out, I've revised my opinion. First of all, that lawyer would not have been in the White House and would not have had access to President. And Nixon, in a very isolated way, he operated, so-and-so's going to come see you, what's it about? And if he ever got wind of that, no one would ever get to see him. It's I'm sure so many of you reach a threshold where you have to say no to a client. Hard things to say. But no one said no to Nixon. Now, he created the environment that made it virtually impossible. In the case of Bush and Obama, you don't want to get me started. Yes, go ahead with the here and then in the back.
President Nixon's White House seemed to be the height of paranoia and yet also control, is what you hear. A lot of this is control. And yet the tapes. Besides hubris, why do you think he allowed the tapes? Every time I hear so much of what we've learned from the tapes, I wonder, with wanting that much control, why did he allow that much to be recorded?
It's a great question. And I would call it, and I don't think this is a term of psychology, but I call it kind of a supremacy complex, that somehow he felt he was so powerful that no one would ever find out about the taping systems. It was a big secret in the White House, and certainly no one would ever get those tapes. And I think he was a practical guy and wanted to write the best memoirs possible. And if he had those tapes, he would be able to, do a kind of fly on the wall, you were there, and edit them and launder them. And so he was, and of course that was the danger of the Nixon presidency. It was so in its bubble that it had no idea that there were outside forces, the media and the prosecutors and the Congress, and that could ever get inside, could ever pierce that. And so you know, I mean, again, to really get into it, why he kept the tapes. I mean, Len Garment, who was one of his lawyers in the White House during the, after Watergate, speculated that at one point Nixon actually took the tapes up to his bedroom and had them put under the bed. And Garment went on some sort of, you know, psychoanalytic binge, which I won't even repeat, about that. Or I don't know that he actually got the tapes there, but he wanted to put them under his bed. It is amazing that he kept them. And I'll tell this story real quickly. After Dean testified in June of '73 saying that Nixon was involved in all of these conspiratorial activities and so forth, and we didn't know about the tapes, the Senate Watergate committee set on a track of, okay, let's take all the satellite witnesses from the White House who may confirm what Dean said or contradict it. And I knew Sam Dash, who was the chief counsel, and other people, and they'd say, well, you know, kind of Sam Ervin's question, who are your sources? And we would always say no. But I remember they asked at one point, said, well, who hasn't talked? And I said, there's a guy named Alexander Butterfield, who was deputy chief of staff. I went to his house one night and knocked on the door, and the curtains opened and closed, and no one would ever come to the door and could never get in touch with Butterfield. And so they called Butterfield. It was a Friday, hot Friday, July 13th, 1973, and did one of these full interrogations. And Butterfield disclosed that there was a secret taping system in the Oval Office, on Nixon's phones. I mean, if you go to the Nixon Library out in California, they have a doll's house mock-up of the Oval Office and says, press this button and a red light will go on everywhere there was a microphone in the Oval Office. And you press the button and the Oval Office lights up like a Christmas tree. There were 5 microphones on the desk. And, but it seemed inconceivable. So some people told me that that Friday and Saturday that there was a secret taping system. I couldn't believe it. But they said, you know, this is a guy who knows. And I remember kind of thinking about it all day on Saturday. And I called Ben Bradley, the editor of the Post, broke the chain of command as we always did. And just called him at 9 o'clock and said, I hate to disturb you, but there's a secret taping system in the White House. Everything's taped. And he said, what? I said, yeah, you know. And he said, so I asked, said, what do you think? And he said, in his way, he said, I wouldn't bust one on it. And he said, I think it's just a B+ story, so don't worry. So I relaxed Saturday and Sunday, and next Monday they called Butterfield to testify in what was electric testimony, to say there's this secret taping system. And I remember Ben coming down by my desk and knocking on it and saying, okay, it's better than a B+. Now, you think about that, and this is our luck and this is Bradley's luck. If he'd said, oh my God, get on it, write that story, and we'd published it before Butterfield testified before a formal congressional inquiry, it could have given Nixon grounds to say, you know, it's the goddamn Washington Post, I'm burning the tapes. And, you know, that could have happened. And so in a sense, I mean, the Bradley genius as a reporter, it's like, is not just what to put in the paper, but what not to put in the paper. Long answer. Next. Sir.
I have a question. I'd like your comments about the state of investigative journalism. Watergate broke when I was in high school. I consider it one of the high marks of that topic. we're in a very different world now. I mean, it was Walter Cronkite.
You noticed.
It was Walter Cronkite, epitomizing one form of journalism at that point. And my question is, and I guess the best tangible, I think of the second Iraq War, and where was the press? And I just wonder if you've written about this, you can direct me to that. But
I wrote 4 books
Okay.
about the Iraq War and the Afghan War, and interviewed Bush for hours and hours about it. Let him have his say, but you couldn't, there was no way to stop the Iraq War from the point of view of the media. At the same time, I fault myself mightily, just as an example, before the Bush ordered the invasion in March of 2003, I wrote a front page story in the Washington Post saying there's no smoking gun evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Have you ever written something and not understood what it means? Because if you have I didn't understand it. And if I should have thought and really worked on no smoking gun evidence, what does that mean? You have no hard evidence. If you have no hard evidence, you don't have anything. And I'd been working on this intensely, and as I say, I fault myself mightily for not being more aggressive on it. But whether you could have changed anything or not, I mean, here's the CIA director, as I reported in the Oval Office, telling President Bush and his team that it's a slam dunk case that can be made that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And of course, as we know, he was wrong. I believe they had weapons of mass destruction, and I was wrong. The media, to answer your question, we don't have the money to do enough deep investigations. The culture of the internet creates a climate of impatience and speed. Give it to me now, give me the sound bite. And when Carl and I worked on Watergate stories, we could work for 2 or 3 weeks on one story. Editors would review drafts, get more sources, make sure you're right, and we made mistakes along the way, but there was a kind of patience about it. But now, if you have what looks like a real or apparent incremental increase on a story, somebody will be in your office and say, can we get it on the internet by noon so we don't dive into things? Now, happily, and I think this is good news, Jeff Bezos is buying the Washington Post next month for $250 million. Don Graham wishes it was $250 billion. And 1% of Jeff Bezos's net worth. I've known him for years. He came to the Post. We had a long private breakfast, and I think he knows you have to spend money to really dig into things. And I believe he will, and I hope I do better, frankly, more. I've written 2 books about Obama and got in lots of tangles with the Obama White House because they don't like to be challenged. And like no White House, like people don't like to be challenged. And the message managers and the capacity to spin is off the charts now. And so the only way to get around that is to have the time and the money to work for weeks or months or even a year or longer on some of these stories. I remember having dinner with Eric Schmidt one time when he was CEO of Google. And I said, it's going to be on your tombstone. I killed newspapers. He said, what? How can you say that? I love newspapers. And I said, well, you've got all of our money now. And like a good CEO, he said, well, it's our money now. And that's true. I mean, if you we're going to buy a refrigerator in Washington 30 years ago, you'd look at the Washington Post. Now you go on Google or some equivalent, and You can't find an ad sometimes for anything in the Washington Post, let alone a refrigerator. Here? Yeah, okay.
Since we're all lawyers in the room, I thought I'd turn us back to lawyers for a second. And I'm
Sure.
intrigued by your comment that you don't think over the course of time you've come to the conclusion that a lawyer saying to Nixon, you can't do this, it's illegal, wouldn't have stopped him. I wonder if you would reflect for a second on two of the personalities in particular, and whether you hold that view. If either John Mitchell or John Dean had counseled him that you just can't do it, would that have changed anything?
But see, they knew Nixon. I mean, particularly Mitchell, been his law partner in New York, knew the mindset. And the mindset was, you know, the law, you know, there were, you know, I mean, think of it. When I first learned back in the 70s about these meetings in Mitchell's office while he's Attorney General. Now, I mean, you're Attorney General, you know, you could be, and you are there, and some wacko bird named Gordon Liddy comes in with charts made at the CIA about bugging teams and prostitutes and kidnap teams, and you would sit there and you'd kind of smoke your pipe. I don't know, these like Mitchell, and you said, well, that's too expensive. I mean, I don't think you could ever get Mitchell, when we did the first story on Mitchell controlling this secret fund which financed Watergate. Carl called Mitchell and woke him up at night before we ran the story. Good journalistic rule, always call and notify people you're running the story and ask. And he read the story to Mitchell, and Mitchell go, Jesus, and read a little bit more of the story, and Mitchell said, Jesus, we're going to do a story on you guys someday. And then he said, if you publish that, Katharine Graham, I'll quote him, is going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer. That's the mindset. And so you think this is the guy who's going to go in and tell Nixon you can't do that? Pardon?
I guess what I was really asking was about Nixon's mindset. If you accept the fact that somebody, take the hypothetical, take that somebody in John Mitchell's role, an attorney general, would have said to him, you can't do this, it's illegal, could it have changed his mind?
No, I don't think so. First of all, you wouldn't have had an attorney general who had, you know, it didn't happen. I mean, I didn't talk about this, but the Len Garment and Fred Bazart, the lawyers managing Watergate, after the first, you know, after Haldeman and Ehrlichman left and so forth, I mean, they had a real struggle of conscience, and it was November 73. So this is, 9 months before Nixon resigned. They went down to see Nixon in Key Biscayne because they were going to recommend he resigned because there were too many, as they put it, sharks in the water. There are too many tentacles, too many, you know, the Vesco thing, this wiretap, this break-in, I mean, it was the list. And so they went to talk to Al Haig, who was chief of staff, and presented their case, and they were not allowed to see Nixon. They were just, the wall came down. And so could somebody get in there? I don't know. Now, I think the real interesting question is, has the lesson of Watergate been absorbed, take the Clinton administration. He had his problems with Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky and so forth, and he never kind of figured out, you got to come clean, and he wouldn't come clean and got in all kinds of legal trouble. And the judge in the case ruled that what he had done was, in the civil suit, is lie. And so, there's human nature functioning here. But what you need, and I won't dwell on this, but if you look at the Obama White House, I've got to know Obama well, and that people, I think they're well intended, but first of all, they don't know how to negotiate. Obama doesn't. Anyone here ever been involved in a negotiation? Anyone married? That's the ultimate what do you learn in a negotiation? You learn, first of all, you have to spend a lot of time. You need all-nighters, weekends, and so forth. And as you go through the process of an extended negotiation, you learn that the person, your adversary on the other side of the table, is your best friend. Why? Because that's the person who can give you what you want and need. And they just don't get there. And I cite that as there is a team in the Obama White House with good intention, in my view, the best of intention in almost all cases, but they don't know how to do it. And that the lack of experience and the lack of, I'll tell you a story. Earlier in the year, I was talking to a senator who was one of Obama's biggest supporters, a Democrat, is chairman of one of the really important committees in the Senate. If I told you who it was, you would understand, one of the key people. And I was talking to him about, Obama just doesn't make these connections. He doesn't spend time with people. His meetings with John Boehner are an hour or 50 minutes. And kind of laying out this in the center, so I don't know how you can say that. Why, in the last 5 years, he's called me twice. Twice? Now, if you knew who this was, you'd say, oh, this is somebody who talks to Obama every week, every month. And it just doesn't happen. There is not that human connection. And that's part of now, on the legal issues, I don't know. I mean, Obama, clearly, I remember I was over there in the West Wing talking to one of his aides on a Friday, or waiting to talk to one of his aides, and Obama walks in. And it's a Friday afternoon, and we talked a little bit about Watergate, and so he, I think, understands Watergate cerebrally, and then his aide came in and said, when you guys were working on the Nixon case, Obama was 10. So, anyway, where were we? Give me the hook when we're out of time, but I'm not. Two more, okay, go ahead.
Do you think we have adequate institutional safeguards to prevent Watergate from happening again?
No.
And if we don't, what institutional safeguards do you feel we need in order to prevent it from happening again?
I think it's not an institutional question. I think it has to do with character and people and the level of experience they have. And not to dwell on this, but I did this in the book Shadow about the legacy of Watergate in the Reagan administration. Iran-Contra was a big deal, and Howard Baker became chief of staff, and he had been the vice chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee, who asked that question, well remembered, what did the president know and when did he know it? And Baker internalized the lessons of Watergate, and he went to be the chief of staff to Reagan in the midst of Iran-Contra, and there was talk, Reagan's involved, he's going to be impeached, he's going to resign, he's whatever. And you know what Howard Baker did? Called a lawyer, had a general counsel in the White House, and then brought in a team to investigate Reagan. They read all of Reagan's diaries. They interviewed the president 13 times and found out that there was no evidence that Reagan knew about the illegal diversion, or at least there was none that Reagan could remember. And that was a case of, institution responding, but it was to the chief of staff. I think we have time for one more question. Ma'am, yes, go ahead. Give her the microphone, if you would. Gordon Liddy supplied all the microphones.
Bud Crow said yesterday, almost in passing, that in August of 73, within 2 weeks of, August of 74, within 2 weeks of the president's resignation, but before the pardon, that Crow went down to San Clemente and met with the president. My reaction, the former president then, my reaction as a criminal defense lawyer is, how did you get in there and have those conversations? You become a fact witness. There hadn't been a pardon yet. And I spoke to Mr. Crow afterwards, and he said there were no lawyers involved. Ron Ziegler was the person who was controlling access, and I guess...
Oh, my God, that was one of the problems.
Right, of course. And so I guess I have two questions for you. First, did you know contemporaneously that then former President Nixon was having conversations with people about the facts of what had occurred previously? And second, sort of another lesson for lawyers that comes from all of this.
Well, you know, I guess if Nixon had a defense lawyer at that point, he wouldn't let Crow in. You're right, but I don't know whether I don't know whether he really did at that point. So I don't think that's really really relevant. You know, I mean, the last point I would make is, you know, what should we worry about now? I mean, what's going on in Washington is a horrendous nightmare. What's going on in the world is a dangerous place. One of the CIA people came over to my house recently and said, there's North Korea, there's China, there's Pakistan. North Korea has 4 nuclear weapons. Pakistan has 200 nuclear weapons. Unstable government. Iran is working or not working on getting nuclear weapons. The whole Syria problem, anyway, went through country by country, and he said the fuse of instability is lit in each of those countries, the fuse of instability or chaos, and it may go off tomorrow in one of them, it may go off in 5 years, it may never go off, but there is so much instability there that and he said, his worry, and this is an insider saying this, that the policies of the Obama administration are not sufficient to the task. Like I was saying, I don't think the media, I don't think we're geared up. I don't think we are capable of doing the investigative, in-depth work, whatever you. And so this guy, I said, so this should be your next book. And I said, well, I don't know. And he said, and I have a working title for you, Meltdown. That cheers you up. And it really is dangerous what's going on. And what I think we ought to worry about the world, worry about Washington in this all these fiscal issues. I mean, if you have a seatbelt, put it on the next 30 days, what's going to go on in Washington. But the key worry I have is secret government, that in the end, that's what Watergate was about. That's what so many of these problems are about. And in the end, that's what will do us in. And I forget the name of the judge who said it, but he said, democracies die in darkness. And I think that's absolutely right. And I think we better worry about the darkness because there's too much of it. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks. Thank you.